witches certainly are the ultimate outsider. I think certainly there was an attempt to, and you can hardly blame people really, considering it was a crime punishable by death in the past. Of course, people have tried to sanitize it and to make it more socially acceptable. We maybe ate them and that they ate us and we ate each other and all kinds of things going back to the Stone Age, that there's lots of examples of human bones that have been tossed on the same pile as the rest of the hunted animals that have been eaten. That's the ghost of the cannibal, the ultimate outsider, the monstrous force in witches, which has been pushed outside the village for so long that it started to get angry.
Hello and welcome to the Pagan Portal Podcast, produced by Moonbooks Publishing and presented by me, Rachel Patterson. Today we are stretching across the waters to the other side of the planet from me, which is always technologically amazing to me that we can do that. I'm very pleased to welcome fellow author and witch Lee Morgan. Welcome.
Hi Rachel, how are you?
Good, thank you. Looking forward to today's chat because you have some fascinating subjects that you've written about. The good old boring question, or perhaps difficult question, depending on how you look at it. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, I suppose that I am a person of the outside in that I am a queer polyamorous person living in a joint community on a mountain in a forest, and I'm a writer on top of that, which makes me a person of the outside in a number of ways. Yeah, I suppose above everything else, I'm a witch. That would be the main identifier that I associate with, for sure.
We do like labels, don't we? What is it about that? I don't know.
As my first book indicated, I do think it is a deed without a name. So in some ways, identifying yourself is difficult.
But I think it can help us belong as well somehow, doesn't it? To find a place in the world that's got a label.
Well, yes, it helps you find other people who believe roughly the same thing, experience the same thing.
And now a difficult question, or, a lot of people find it difficult. Your spiritual pathway, how would you describe it?
I call myself an old craft witch or a traditional witch, generally speaking, mainly because I feel there's something really profound about that connection to the past and tradition. And I belong to something that has accumulated over time, and I've received different things over time. And I think I'm really aware of that because coming from an Australian family that's based in Britain, I've had that contact off and on with old things and folklore and superstitions, and then sort of been taken away from it and taken back to Australia. So I've always had that sense that there was something older, something that I wanted to have my roots in that would take me right back to my ancestors. I think that's why I was interested in traditional witchcraft in particular. As soon as I heard the term,
that's quite a difference, isn't it? English folklore to Australian. It must be poles apart, literally.
Yeah, it is, and in a lot of ways, there's a certain alienation, I suppose, in Australia from the folklore of the place. I mean, not so much the recent folklore, but the older material. Naturally, there isn't that ancestral connection, and I feel very connected to this mountain that I live on, but I know that the people that were here, that there's a difference there fundamentally in their background and mine, and I love and honor it, but it's very different to what I felt when I've been back in England.
Connection's important though, isn't it, to the land? I mean, you must be absolutely rooted in your land that you live on, and I think that's really important.
Yeah, I do too.
I'm going to mention your new book because the title itself is intriguing. People of the Outside, Witchcraft, Cannibalism and the Elder Folk. That is that brings together so many different things. The intriguing The intriguing bit is cannibalism, but we will come to it. The other bit is people of the outside. Who do you mean by people of the outside?
Well, I think it's deliberately vague in the sense that it refers to anybody that's ever been placed outside the pale or outside the hedge or made into some form of an outsider. And I think witches certainly are the ultimate outsider, but as I will discuss later as well, there's a lot of other groups that also fall into that general situation of being outcasts, I suppose. And I think for me, all of that stuff that's in this book, it all sort of percolated to the surface during my still relatively recent brain tumor situation, where I suppose felt quite outside of everything while I was recovering. And some of these themes that are in this book, they're sort of pet themes of mine that kind of came together in one big sort of black soup.
It is a fascinating book. And as witches, we are used to being on the outside, aren't we? I mean, witches always lived on the boundaries, didn't they? They always lived on the outskirts of places. And I must admit, whenever anybody talks about the witch living on the edge of the village, it's usually female. Do you find that? Have you found that in your research? Were they always women? And I find a lot, even in modern times, that perhaps it's weighted more, that there are more female witches than men. Is that what you found in your research?
Yes, mostly. I mean, it varies from place to place what the concentration of women is in relation to the concentration of men. Like if you're talking about sort of the persecutions, that era, I think Iceland, for instance, had a much higher proportion of men that were persecuted as sorcerers during that time. I think it has a bit to do with the local beliefs. But that being said, by and large, yes, like 90% probably, if not higher in most cases, tended to be women. And if they were men, they usually were on the outside for some other reason. And there's a fairly big part in my book where I talk about the link between the way that menstrual blood's been viewed as a taboo in a lot of cultures all around the world, and the same way that different minority groups have been treated as unclean. And I think that unclean theme is a big part of that book for that reason. And I think humans tend to make any group that they wish to push down into something which is classed as unclean. And often, accusations of cannibalism can be one of the things that people have used to make another group into something less than human in their eyes. And I think women, unfortunately, in many cultures around the world, have been on the receiving end of a sort of, bias, I guess, against them. And I think that that's part of the reason, breaking through whatever that mysterious power is that women possess, has been part of the witchcraft narrative for a really long time. It's a way to try to break through that by having a thing you can accuse somebody of, simply for power that might not have even been witchcraft, that might have simply been a strong personality or whatever the thing may be.
Oh, I would have been, I would have been the first one they burn. Yeah, it is a theme, isn't it? It does seem to be a theme. And there are lots of cultures that have, women used to have red tents, didn't they? When they had their periods, they were all sent off to some corner of the village to sit together. And yeah, I hadn't made that connection until I read the book with menstrual blood and it being women. And it is an interesting take on it that makes perfect sense. Do you think that is still the same now, perhaps? I do still find in a lot of groups that there are more female witches than men. Do you think that's something that's carried through?
Yeah, mostly. I think it's mostly true. I tend to find that women and queer men tend to make up the bulk of the circles that I tend to move in. But I don't know, our witch house does have a fairly wide range of women, men, queer people of each description, you know. But I think we're a bit unusual in that respect. Most other groups that I know, there's a lot of male occult writers, certainly, but in terms of people's groups and traditions, one tends to find that women tend to outnumber men for sure.
Yeah, we find the same. I mean, we're welcoming, we're open to anyone and everyone. But yeah, that does seem to be just how it falls, really, doesn't it? For whatever reason. Now, you do talk about the witch in her many guises. There is this idea, there is this public face of the witch. Has it been sanitized? Has it been dumbed down now in modern times, do you think?
I think certainly there was an attempt to. And you can hardly blame people, really, considering it was a crime punishable by death in the past. Of course, people have tried to sanitize it and to make it more socially acceptable. But I think another one of the reasons that attracted me to traditional witchcraft was the fact that I sort of see that movement, however you want to look at that movement, as being a reaction to that. I think it is an attempt to bring back the teeth and claws of that original concept, which I think is a sort of boldness that maybe we felt that we could have now after it hasn't been a crime, at least in our country, for a very long time. I think it's very natural that people attempt to sanitize it. I mean, God, wouldn't you want to sanitize something that had that history? Yeah, I do, definitely.
Oh, I think you're right that my witchcraft started a million years ago in probably the more acceptable version. But as the years have gone, I'm very much blood and teeth now. I love folk magic. I love that traditional witchcraft. It makes so much more sense to me. Yeah, I think you're right. It is probably still not acceptable in some circles. You have to kind of gauge, don't you?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it's all very well for us to be quite bold about the sort of working with both hands aspect of witchcraft as the blessing and also binding and baiting and all that sort of thing amongst other witches, but you wouldn't discuss it sort of, you know, in a standard town situation.
No. And it kind of leads me to the question about witchcraft being feared. I'm lucky. I've never had any adverse reaction as such when I say I'm a witch. I've been laughed at. People don't believe it's real. But people do still fear it, don't they? Do you find that?
I think so, yes. I mean, if you tell somebody that you're a witch and they laugh at you and then you ask them for a piece of their hair, generally speaking, they don't want to give you the piece of their hair. So it's
a good test. I think perhaps the whole Hollywood fiction idea of a witch has probably played into that as well, hasn't it?
Probably. I think it, certainly shaped the way that people view the concept. But I think a lot of what's gone on in Hollywood has been more towards making it slightly more palatable on average. But I think there's a bit of both out there.
So now I have to come to the cannibalism because it is quite intriguing. Would you like to explain a little bit further on that?
Well, as you probably know, during the persecutions, one of the things that witches were fairly regularly accused of was stealing body parts often of infants, sometimes of other dead people, to use for ointments, to use for curses. Very, very popular in some persecution narratives, this concept, and sometimes also to eat. these body parts. And cannibalism, if you look at it as a accusation, has been leveled at a lot of different minorities over time. And, one of the minorities that it's been leveled at well, not minorities exactly, but I suppose what our own ancestors are sort of known to have practiced it based on archaeological things that we've found that have suggested that, there seems to have been a certain willingness to harvest bits of human beings. And I don't know, it got me thinking, because I have a bit of a sort of strong area of interest in early human paleontology and stuff like that. And I noticed once we found out that as Homo sapiens that we've got quite a lot of Neanderthal DNA in us, I started to think about it in terms of like it was almost like we ate them, in the sense of having consumed this other people that we thought had disappeared and gone extinct, but really they've disappeared into us. And we don't look like them anymore, but we still carry them. And it all got me thinking, from there, sort of linking one thing to another and thinking about the way that, the cannibal motif has been used to take away people's personhood. And in the book, I sort of look at a few different groups that have been accused of cannibalism, and sometimes they're people living right near us that we accuse of eating people. And it's fascinating to me that when we were living at that time in a culture that was using bits of human mummies and such, like in folk medicine all the time, where they were powdering out bits of dried humans, not even, they called them mummies, but they weren't all mummies. Some of them were simply just very dry human bodies that were used in folk medicine for all kinds of complaints, and eating them and using them as like ointments and all kinds of different things, that we were so offended by this notion that some other people might have eaten people. And yeah, so I got into this little loop, I guess, with a couple of these areas of interest of mine that took me down this pathway.
No, I found that when I've been researching flying ointment recently, a lot of the old recipes suggested that witches would boil babies for their fat to make the ointment out of. Quite why they couldn't use, lard or something. I don't know, but apparently it had to be baby fat.
But it's interesting, I mean, considering that doctors at the time often did use human fat in their unguents and like actual doctors, not just folk healers. So it's a really interesting complaint, I think, to make against another group at a time when there was this actual socially acceptable cannibalism going on in the society. And
like you mentioned the Neanderthals, I'm going back to that point, it would have been survival, wouldn't it? It would, I'm assuming they would have on occasion eaten each other literally to survive.
Yes. Yeah, and I mean, we have what you might class as, I mean, maybe not proof, but definitely evidence suggesting that they ate each other, and that we maybe ate them, and that they ate us, and we ate each other, and all kinds of things going back to the Stone Age, that there's lots of examples of human bones that have been tossed on the same pile as the rest of the hunted animals that have been eaten, and they show butchery marks, they show charring marks of having been cooked and the marrow extracted. And so, yeah, it's an interesting sort of topic in that regard, because it seems to have been quite normal almost in the past.
I apologise if anyone's eating their dinner. I hope we haven't put anyone off their food. Just, thought I'd put that out there. Now, moving swiftly onwards from that, but it is a fascinating subject.
Right.
And I think it is, it's about putting yourself in a different time frame, in a different situation, isn't it? To understand how and why these things happened.
And I mean, some of that could have even been funerary cannibalism, where some cultures eat a certain part of an honoured ancestor to keep them in their body. So there's all kinds of reasons that could have happened. It wasn't necessarily survival cannibalism. But yeah.
In a bizarre, horrific way, you can kind of see the logic to some of it as well, can't you?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And I think up until very recently, so could our ancestors, who were involved in the healing profession very much, and even believed that so this is probably more don't listen to this while you're eating kind of stuff, but the the remains of children and babies were considered more powerful at a medical level because they died with all of their life force still intact.
Okay. Yeah.
And that's not even witches, that's actually just a medical viewpoint at the time.
Yeah, different perspectives from different eras. That makes sense.
Wow.
Cool.
Yeah, it sort of does in a way.
Now, you also talk about witch blood, or blood in general, and it has played a huge part in witchcraft throughout history. And for those of the more traditional vein, we do still work with blood of all sorts, don't we?
I suppose my views on this topic are that I think everybody has witch blood. If you look at the way genetics work and the sheer number of ancestors that we all possess, everybody would be descended from somebody that either was or was accused of being a witch. You can guarantee that that would be true. I think what happens in the body of somebody that is marked or is called in some way by the spirits is that blood comes awake, it comes alive in the person. It's filled with witch fire, and then it takes life. It takes on life, I should say. Yeah, and I think as such, blood has been quite an important symbol of a lot of different things. I think the original beginnings of the concept of witch blood was not a prestige thing, which I think is often an interesting one in the debates that you hear on the topic. Today you hear a lot of people sort of, I don't know, I think that it's maybe the concept has been tainted a little bit by some recent sort of nationalist movement concepts about bloodlines and the idea of them as pure bloodlines and stuff. I think it actually goes back to something quite different. It goes back to the heretical bloodlines that were charted out after people were accused of heresy. Often that restraint on their descendants continued for generations afterwards, and it was sort of believed that you were of a tainted blood. And it wouldn't have been a prestige, it would have been a taint in those days. Like a lot of things with witchcraft, we've sort of taken some of those things that would have been considered of low prestige, and we've sort of reclaimed them as something that has migrated to this point where it actually has high prestige, where people are like, how dare someone say that they have witch blood and other people don't? And it's really fascinating for me from a historical point of view to see that it's come all that way around from, you can't even work in certain professions if you were accused of heresy in some parts of Europe, if you were down to the 7th generation afterwards. And yeah, now these days it's taken on the opposite sort of meaning almost in occult circles.
I kind of think when I'm on this pathway that I'm not learning witchcraft, I'm remembering it.
Well, yes.
From wherever.
Well, yeah, exactly. And I mean, the way I would see that is you, like everybody, would have that in your blood somewhere. But for some reason, you or some other force has chosen to awaken that in you, and you're remembering. I think that is actually real. I think we are remembering the craft as we go along in life, and it's waking up in our blood.
And I want to I'm going back to cannibalism again. It's going to pull me back all the time, I think. But one of the phrases in your book that caught my attention, you say, "How do we meet the ghost of the cannibal?" What do you mean by that?
Well, I guess what I was trying to get across was the ultimate outsider. I was trying to get across that concept of meeting up with that part of the human story which has been outlawed and pushed to one side. And to me, cannibalism is not just actual. It's not just about humans eating other people, though, of course, it is also about that. But it's also all of the different predation forms of witchcraft that you hear about, where like sending the nightmare and hagging someone and taking the cream from their dairy farm and removing things to eat, which is not exactly their flesh, but is their livelihood and, you know, their life force even. And cannibalism is a metaphor for that taking of dominion over something by people that don't naturally have dominion, like by women and elderly widowed folks and queer people and, you know, different racial minorities and all kinds of different groupings. I think they didn't have that power. And those aspects of witchcraft, which we tend to go, "Ooh, I don't know if I really want to own up to that or talk about that or whatever," often those are forms of addressing that inequality in some way. And I think cannibalism is almost a metaphor as much as it is an actual thing.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think that's the ghost of the cannibal. I think it is the ultimate outsider, the monstrous force in witches, which has been pushed outside the village for so long that it started to get angry. And, you know, for me, at the time I was writing that book, I had been through this really harrowing experience, and I wanted to, you know, push a few buttons and talk about the things that are, you know, that you're not allowed to talk about, I guess, usually. The things that put people off their dinner.
I think we're successfully doing that. Now, another thing that caught my attention, there's so much in this book that caught my attention, but one of the things that you talk about is the long teeth.
The long teeth I came across first of all in a Irish saga called The Hags of the Long Teeth. Maybe not saga, maybe folk tale. And I've come across it in a few places in German sources as well, where they talk about how as witches get older, their teeth will believed to grow. And this was something that got me interested because I have this long, you know, fascination with Neanderthal people and with early man in general. I just started thinking about the big teeth because that is a thing that differentiates the skull of a Neanderthal person from a Homo sapiens person. And all of these hags, these sort of hideous figures that we are taught are awful. They often are described as having extremely long teeth. And when you start looking at the facial structure that they are described as having, or the typical witch's facial structure, it bears a lot in common with Neanderthal people and with early man in general. There's the hooked, crooked nose, the protruding teeth, the protruding brow. All of that stuff is part of the facial structure of very early humans. And yeah, it got me intrigued, and I just started looking at the facial structure in a new way as maybe a memory. And not a logical memory, not the kind of like, oh, I remember what I did when I was 5 kind of memory, but that sort of ancestral memory that is coming alive in people who practice witchcraft very explicitly, I think exists in the public as well at some level without them realizing it. And this repressed image of this other human that we may have cannibalized, which we may actually have cannibalized, but also metaphorically cannibalized into our own species, but through interbreeding, I feel that image just keeps popping out in different cultures, that it's still in there. It's sort of seething away. I mean, it's 3% at least of our ancestors were Neanderthals, or in some cases, other ancient races of human too. And yeah, so that was where the long teeth thing began.
And it makes sense. Again, it all makes sense. We do carry a lot of things that are now fight and flight reactions, anxiety, panic attacks, and that's all linked to our ancestors and running from ferocious animals and things. So that does, the fact that we hold on to that idea, it does. It makes perfect sense.
And it's very intrinsic to our language. Like, you think about what we talk about, we say that that's lowbrow comedy, or that person has a weak chin, so they must have a weak character, or all of those facial features are linked to problems with people in our mind. Like that facial structure is not a prestigious thing. And I find that really intriguing. I'm like, why do we feel that? And how far back does that go in our sort of epigenetic memory, where we are capable of sort of remembering things for long periods of time at that intuitive level?
Now, you mentioned the hag, and that brings a picture, doesn't it? The word hag brings a picture of the old crone, like I say, with the hook nose and long teeth, and not a pretty picture by any means. But you mentioned kissing the hag in your book, and that's a term that I've heard on occasion over the years. Is there a story behind that?
Yes, I suppose probably the most well-known one would be Nile of the Nine Hostages, where there is 9 brothers that are all wanting to get a drink from a particular well, and there is this hag that is guarding the well, and she refuses to let any of the brothers have a drink from the well unless they kiss her. And, most of Niall's brothers refuse to kiss her and therefore don't get access to the well. But Niall not only is willing to kiss her, but jumps on top of her with the intention of having sex with her. And she immediately shows herself to be, I don't think not a hag is the right way to put it, but also something else. I'm very big on the whole things are also something else, rather than that the beautiful damsel is her true form. I don't believe that. I think she's both of those things, because she then reveals herself to be the sovereignty of Ireland. And without having accepted her in that form with her long teeth, which they describe in that as well, and in that she's also black in colour, which I think by that they mean black, rather than racially black. And they describe her hair as being like the mane of a horse, and there's all this very, earthy imagery attached to her. But then when he goes, I won't just kiss you, and he leaps onto her, then all of a sudden she's also this beautiful damsel that they describe on. And to me, that story has something very deep in it, because it's talking about the way that these horrific things, which are classed as not pretty, and they're not, glamorous or desirable, they have to be accepted in the form that they are before you can get to see that there's more to them than just that. And yeah, I think that the kissing the hag story, which is repeated in a few different places in folk tales, sort of tells us that story. It tells us that there's a lot of things that don't look pretty by Homo sapiens standards, which are actually very powerful and potent and necessary if you want to drink from the well.
We do go for the outward, don't we? We do make judgments from the outward appearance.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And I think everything can be both and in that regard rather than either or. And I don't think that it's ugly or beautiful. I think that the sovereignty of Ireland is, both, ugly, beautiful, everything on the spectrum between, or maybe those words don't even count. Maybe they're just human preferences. It's yeah, that's sort of where that came from for me.
You mentioned skulls in the shape of Neanderthals and how the differences, the changes. I think as witches, most of us are drawn to skulls. It is, whether they are animal ones or human ones, we're drawn to them for some particular reason. I generally personally associate human skulls with ancestors. I work with animal skulls for the spirit of the animal. I wasn't aware till I read your book that the shape of the skull was significant, or even perhaps a fashion thing at some point.
Yeah, skull binding in some parts of the world. Interestingly, rather diverse parts of the world too. It's been quite a big deal, the flattening of the baby's head so that they can create like a higher back part of the head, and flattening out the brow was quite popular in a lot of places, quite diverse places, even including some Aboriginal Australian examples of it. It's quite a strange and interesting thing. And what it seems to do, although of course you can't make the teeth protrude in the same way that a lot of earlier human teeth would have been longer and protruded, but it kind of mimics the shape of the older people's head. And I talk quite a bit about that in my book, about the notion that there must have been a mixed culture around the world depending on, the ancestral memory, I guess, of that group, whether or not it was a thing of shame, which it seems to have become in the areas where witches look a bit like that, as opposed to areas where people actually tried to copy that head shape. And it's, there's a lot written about that, and a lot of it is about aliens, which is not a topic I touch on really in the book, but the artificial deformation of the skull, to me, is an interesting possible memory reverberating through humans of people whose heads were different to our own.
A bizarre practice. I hadn't heard about that one at all.
Wow.
Yeah.
Well,
we do strange things to each other, don't we?
We do. And to the heads of newborn babies that can't resist the binding. It's quite fascinating. I mean, some parts of America in particular have some remarkable human head finding, like in mummified form and skulls like that.
Bit bizarre. Very, we are strange creatures, that's for sure. Now, I did mention flying ointment earlier, so I'm going to take us to poles, distaffs and broomsticks, which obviously the witch is traditionally associated with. You do mention them in the book. What's the importance of them and the use of them for flying?
I sort of touched on one aspect of them in particular, and that was the idea that if you go back far enough in history, the things that witches, regardless of culture, were shown to ride, because it wasn't just brooms, it was all kinds of different things, such as a distaff, which was very important symbol of particularly of female power in terms of the creation of thread and cloth. But I realized that in a lot of other cultures around the world, sorcerers were writing on other things, and some of them were tools that we used in rice production. Some of them were, all kinds of different items that in that culture represent power, even including writing on arrows is another one. And I think a lot's been said about brooms in terms of the fact that they go between your legs and that there might be flying ointment on them. And I don't really explore that angle as much because I feel that that's sort of already been written about. But what I thought was interesting about it was that these things, a broom seems like a humble thing today, but it was probably one of the earliest things that would have been invented that would have given you power over your immediate surroundings, just to be able to stick some twigs onto a branch and then be able to sweep out your living space would have been quite an innovation at one point in time. And of course, you've got to also think about what the item is associated with. And obviously with the distaff, it's to do with the creation of fabric. And the broom is about cleanliness. Things that were associated with rice production was about the ability to create the primary foodstuff of that culture. The same with sieves and things like that, which you might associate with different figures, or mortar and pestle is another one, which is a healer's tool, and sieves were used for winnowing grain. So they all go back to, if you think about it primitively rather than as a modern concept, they all go back to things which would have been the original symbols of human power in that culture, your ability to affect your environment. And I thought that was very important, that you're not just writing on anything, you're writing on something which represents that original human ability to affect your environment.
I think we make that mistake quite often. I think we don't see the items as they would have been then. We quite often view them from a modern perspective, which is not helpful a lot of the time.
Yeah, exactly. Like these days we think that, maybe airplanes or something like that are the symbols of human power or the internet, but back then something like that would have been one of the earliest innovations that probably pre-existed Homo sapiens, I would say brooms would have. And there's even signs that Neanderthal people could make string, which was properly woven. So
wow,
there was quite a lot going on in wood, which of course biodegrades. Mm-hmm. So, I find that a very interesting topic.
Yeah, it's about seeing it from a different perspective to understand it. Now, your writing does take you deep into history, which is part of the fascination, I think. How do you start your research? How do you do your research? Are there specific sources that that are your go-to?
Probably through hyperfixation, I think, is probably the best answer for you there in terms of how I start my research. They're just things that I'm obsessed with. And I follow a lot of journals online that give you all the new things whenever they find something. It's like, oh my God, they found string, and it's those little tidbits one at a time kind of thing. And I did do some time at university when I was younger on a completely different topic, but I have, a pretty decent understanding of the language that's used. And I read a lot of the actual academic papers that come out about them, just because I like that kind of thing, I guess.
No, I understand that. I find the whole archaeology of history fascinating, and I think it is a really good starting point for anything, whether you are researching something like witchcraft or I do it when I'm researching goddesses. I'll go back to the or I'll start at the archaeological evidence. And it is, as you say, they're making advances the whole time with modern technology. They're making new discoveries. But I love that string. Wow.
I know. I was so excited also. I think I was in my early 20s or something, the day that they discovered that we possess Neanderthal DNA. And I actually whooped and leapt up and had this massive big reaction to it, because I'd always believed it. I'd always sensed it. I'd always went, no, it's not in our mitochondrial DNA and it's not on our Y chromosome, but it's in there somewhere. And yeah, when I found out, it was a really big deal for me. So I guess this book was my opportunity to bring together a few things that are a really big deal to me.
Oh, I think it's all fascinating. I think perhaps the more technological the advances are, the more that we look backwards now to find our roots. And it's it's a sense of belonging, perhaps.
Yeah, for sure. It makes the past more relatable.
So it is a fascinating book, as all your books are, but there's so much in this one that drew my attention. What do you hope that people will gain from reading this particular one?
I'd like to revivify the strangeness of witchcraft. I think it should be strange. It should be a bit uncomfortable. And I think we have that luxury at this point in history, at least, in my country. I feel we can afford to remind people that it's okay if it is a bit uncomfortable, that it is a bit uncanny. And I think a lot of the topics that I brought up, they are uncomfortable topics, and some parts of the book in particular are quite confronting. And I think that was what I was aiming for, was to take people on a trip through the darkness, I guess, of witchcraft, and to remind them that part still exists, despite the sort of campaign, as I mentioned before, very natural campaign to sort of, make us seem a little less threatening. There is an uncanny quality to the witch, because the witch is everything which has been made into a person of the outside. That they've taken all of the main genres that have been, thrown out of the mainstream Bible of human life. Everything that people don't like has been given to witchcraft. And it doesn't mean that we do all those things, but it's very interesting to be part of a group that is accused of doing all those things. I find that intriguing, and I don't want to just move away from it necessarily, though I know why people have. I'd still like to investigate that feeling and sit with the uncanniness of it a little while.
No, I think it's important. I'm wholeheartedly support you in all of it. I think it's definitely really important to embrace that, and not necessarily bring back a lot of practices,
no,
but understand how they've formed part of what we are today. Yeah, it's very important. And I want to just jump back to, now I first discovered your works with your A Deed Without a Name, which I think was 2013, and I loved it. I loved it straight away. Was that a different experience writing that to your new one?
Yes. I think in a lot of ways I just read Emma Wilby's book, the scholar who talks about Isabel Gowdy, and I had this idea that there was this thing I wanted to say, and it was a relatively humane sort of book, I suppose, by comparison, whereas my recent one, it really came out of the darkness. It came out of being in a neurology ward where I was with people whose brains were damaged, where I was actually at times afraid of people whose brains were damaged in a very understaffed hospital during COVID. You know, like it was a very dark time in my life that this book came out of, and I feel that they're almost chalk and cheese in some ways. You know, I think they share a similar vision of what witchcraft is, but at the same time, this book, this has definitely come out of the underworld parts of my psyche, and also, you know, those experiences too have shaped it.
It is brilliant, but now you talked in Deed Without a Name about the crooked path, and that's a phrase that I see thrown about quite a lot in regard to witchcraft. Does that have a history behind it?
Yeah, it does. I think the one that you'd sort of pull out from written material would be the third road to Elfane, that concept of Thomas Sarima being shown the straight road to evil and the difficult road to virtue, and in the middle was a winding path. I think there's that. There may be something that's biblical related to that as well. I think it does go back a fair way, but it has become quite popular, post-traditional witchcraft, and there's a few different angles that it takes. I think, you have your straight roads between different places in a landscape, and then you have your winding crooked road between them, which is the serpent road, or the sort of the slightly more difficult path of the pilgrimage between the different sites. And I think that witchcraft is a crooked path in the sense that it is a third way. It's neither the path of righteousness nor the path of ultimate sin and destruction. It's a third thing in the middle that sort of meanders through different possibilities, and it's not on its way in a hurry. I think things that are on a straight path, they're trying to get somewhere in a hurry, whereas witchcraft is more of an exploration of possibilities and experience and stuff like that. So I would say
my pathway hasn't been straight.
Wow.
No, not any part of it, I don't think. Now, there seems to be quite a trend of shamanic practitioners, shamanic practices. Do you feel that witchcraft has a strong shamanic connection?
That's an interesting question. Like, I think it depends what you mean by shamanic. I think Emma Wilby's book that I mentioned earlier before, her Isabel Gowdy one, compares witchcraft fairly solidly to what she classes as dark shamanism. I think from a South American perspective, if I'm recalling that correctly. And I think in that respect, she's right. I mean, shamanism is marked out, I guess, in different cultures, like what we call shamanistic practice, by being a social function in some way. You know, it serves a community. And I think even the darker practices of witchcraft have served a community, whether that community is actually a human community or whether it is a woodland community or is, a force of the dead or whatever community it is that you serve. I think there is definitely parallels between. But I think, shamanism is a fairly broad term. And I guess for me, it depends what you'd put under that label, how much in common they have with each other. Because I think most of your traditional forms of shamanism, in, say, Siberia and things like that, they usually serve the human community. And I think there's a lot of times where if you were to take witchcraft in its persecution form, like if you were to believe what is said of witches in the persecution, it seems like maybe they do serve a community, but it's probably not humans. It might be good folk, it might be, a whole range of possible communities.
I think connecting the shamanic practice to community is important. And I think that's probably the part that's been lost in modern times. When people talk about shamanic practices, I think they've lost that idea that that's what the shaman was.
Yeah.
And interesting.
Absolutely.
Which kind of leads me slightly into the connection between witches and the devil. It's mentioned quite a lot by those that perhaps don't know. There is a lot of confusion, isn't there, between witches and the devil?
Well, I suppose it depends which witches.
Good answer.
I'm not too confused, but no, I understand what you're saying. I mean, it is a controversial topic, I suppose, in some circles. Like some people are shocked by it, or they've been brought up Christian and they've rejected that background and they don't want anything connected to that in their practice. And I can understand that. I think for me, the way that I approach that kind of stuff that you might class as, well, I guess it depends whether you class that as heretically Christian or how you would want to view the devil. To me, I view a certain amount of reclaiming and changing. I guess it's very similar to what I was saying about the individual that doesn't have representation in society, who chooses to steal the cream from a very rich person's crop, which could be classed as a bit of a Robin Hood act. It could be seen as, robbing from the rich and giving to the poor. I think in some ways the devil is a bit like that. You could decide to ignore him, but he's also a big part of the culture that you're still a part of. Even if you are a person of the outside, you're a person outside of something. You're not separate from that entirely. And I think that sort of working with entities that are also outsiders, that are also people of the outside, makes sense to some witches more than it does others, I guess.
Yeah, it's an interesting subject. I think when I look at folk history and folklore, particularly about witches flying ointments and, riding the broomstick, the devil's always in there somewhere.
Really? Yeah,
I don't mind him.
I'll take one just quietly. But I think most folkloric sources talk about devils as well, like not just a devil, but the idea of spirits as devils. And I think that's just found its way into popular narratives. And I think that is the case even here in Tasmania, when you look at the reports of when a Christian went out and talked to Aboriginal people about what they believed. The people who could speak enough English to communicate with him, they referred to their spirits as devils. Even here, that. So yeah, I don't know. Or did they? I mean, did he copy out the word as devil? We don't know. But it's interesting to note that that seems to be a fairly wide-ranging behavior for people, to sort of assume not so much an allegiance with the God of the person that's oppressing them, but to think, who is the person who's not the God that's oppressing us? Who is the other party?
And that's where we go.
Yeah.
That's the connection we make.
Yeah.
And the new book is fascinating, and I think it should be recommended reading for anyone that wants to even start the witchcraft pathway, because I think it's got so much important information that we need to remember, that we need to know about to be able to move forward. And witchcraft for me is fluid, and I do think it moves with the times, but I think there's a lot of important information in there that people need to know if you're going to follow the witchcraft path. Fascinating book.
Well, thank you.
We could probably talk for hours, but we are out of time, which is very sad. because There's so much in there and in your other books as well. It has been fascinating. Thank you so much for joining us today. And yes, everyone, listeners, watchers, go and buy the book. Go and buy all of Lee's books, but particularly People of the Outside, Witchcraft, Cannibalism and the Elder Folk. It is fascinating.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us. And thank you to everyone for listening, and do join us again next time on Triple P.
You have been listening to the Pagan Portal Podcast, a Moonbooks Publishing production. For more information, please visit our website.